June 6, 1944. The sea off Normandy boiled with landing craft and wreckage, and the air vibrated under the thunder of naval guns. The American assault on Omaha Beach was among the most brutal hours of the Second World War. Waves of infantry, many from the 1st and 29th Divisions, stepped from Higgins boats into neck-deep water under German fire. Men dropped their rifles to drag wounded comrades ashore. Some drowned before ever reaching sand. Others clung to steel obstacles, waiting for a gap through the hail of machine gun fire. By nightfall, the bluffs above Omaha were scarred with shell holes and smoke, and the beach, once codenamed Easy Red or Dog Green, had been secured at a terrible cost. Over 2,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded before the tide began to retreat. From those first footholds, the Allied armies pushed inland through the hedgerow country of Normandy, a maze of sunken lanes, stone walls, and hidden fields where every orchard could hide an ambush. The 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions moved south toward St. Lo. The 4th Division advanced through Corentin, and the 3rd Armored struggled in the bocage. Engineers blasted through earth banks with explosives just to move tanks forward. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. Rain turned fields into mud, and hedgerow battles dragged on for weeks. Yet slowly, methodically, the Americans broke through. By mid-July, Operation Cobra opened the line. U.S. forces under General Omar Bradley smashed a corridor near St. Lo, unleashing Patton's newly arrived Third Army into open country. Columns of Sherman tanks rolled through wrecked villages toward Avranches. German defenses, once thought impenetrable, began to collapse. In the wake of that breakout, the Americans swept across Brittany and east toward Paris. The war that had begun on a narrow strip of sand was now moving fast across France. Behind them, Omaha's beach defenses lay silent. The engineers cleared mines, medical teams searched for survivors among the dunes, and bulldozers carved temporary roads through wreckage. The same soldiers who had landed under fire now looked east, knowing they were only at the beginning of a far longer road, one that would lead them across Europe to the gates of Dachau. By late summer 1944, the road from Normandy to Paris had become a long column of dust and diesel. The Allied breakout moved with a speed few expected. Armored divisions swept through the French countryside, past towns still burning from retreating German units. Refugees filled the roads, families with carts, children clutching bread, farmers waving flags made from tablecloths. When the American Third Army linked with the French 2nd Armored Division on the outskirts of Paris, it marked not only a military success, but a symbolic victory. The city, occupied for bitter years, was finally free. On August 25th, German General Dietrich von Choltitz surrendered the garrison of Paris. The bells of Notre Dame rang again, echoing through streets filled with flags and tears. American columns entered the city cautiously, tanks moving past cheering crowds, soldiers handing out cigarettes and chocolate, photographers capturing every embrace. Yet, behind the jubilation, the war was far from over. Eisenhower warned that Germany still had strength to fight, and the Siegfried Line stood intact along the western border. By autumn, the front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Mud and exhaustion set in. In the Ardennes, the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg seemed quiet, too quiet. Then, on December 16, 1944, the silence shattered. The Germans launched a massive counteroffensive through the snow-covered hills, striking thinly held American lines. It would be called the Battle of the Bulge. Caught off guard, the 106th and 28th Infantry Divisions faced heavy losses. Entire towns like Saint-Vith and Bastogne became surrounded. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne dug in, cut off and freezing. Supplies fell from the sky in parachute bundles, and medics worked in cellars lit by candles. When German officers demanded surrender, General Anthony McAuliffe's one-word reply, "Nuts," became legend. By late December, skies cleared, and Allied air power returned in force. Patton's Third Army drove north, breaking the siege on December 26th. The Bulge marked the last great German gamble in the West. When the snow melted, the Wehrmacht was spent. American soldiers trudged east again, past wrecked Panther tanks and frozen forests, across the Rhine toward Bavaria. Ahead lay Munich and Dachau, names that would soon take on meanings no soldier could yet imagine to be why March 1945. The Allied advance had reached the western edge of Germany. The Rhine River, wide and fast under its winter current, stood as the last great natural barrier before the heart of the Reich. German resistance was desperate but fractured. Cities like Cologne and Koblenz were little more than ruins from months of bombing. Bridges were blown up as fast as the Wehrmacht could retreat. Yet at Remagen, fortune favored the Americans. On March 7th, the Ludendorff Bridge, damaged but still standing, was captured by troops of the 9th Armored Division. The crossing electrified the Allied command. Within hours, engineers reinforced the structure under fire, and the U.S. First Army poured across, establishing a bridgehead east of the Rhine. What had seemed an obstacle became a floodgate. Patton's Third Army forced crossings further south within days, using pontoon bridges and amphibious vehicles. Streams of tanks, trucks, and infantry surged into the heartland. Villages surrendered without a fight. Others resisted with fanatic resolve. Along the way, soldiers encountered scenes of destruction beyond anything in France. Entire towns were flattened, civilians displaced, and prisoners of war marched west in endless columns. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself, reduced to sporadic sorties easily swatted from the sky. As April began, American divisions advanced deep into Bavaria. The 45th Infantry Division pushed toward Munich. The 20th Armored Division moved alongside them, and the 42nd, the Rainbow Division, covered the northern approach. Resistance collapsed into chaos. Roads were jammed with surrendering troops and civilians fleeing east from the advancing Soviets. Yet, amid the confusion, intelligence reports began filtering in rumors of a concentration camp near a place called Dachau. No one in the ranks quite knew what to expect. The American soldiers moving south had seen war's worst. Beaches littered with bodies, villages bombed to ash, forests filled with frozen dead. But the stories reaching their commanders spoke of something different: systematic cruelty on a scale beyond imagination. Orders were issued to proceed cautiously. On April 29, 1945, the leading elements of the 45th and 42nd Divisions approached the gates of Dachau. What they were about to find would forever redefine what the war had been fought for. The morning of April 29, 1945, began quietly for the men of the 45th and 42nd Infantry Divisions. The Bavarian air was cool, the war seemingly winding down. Then came the first sight of the train, a line of rail cars just outside the Dachau complex, each filled with hundreds of bodies. Many were stripped, emaciated, and twisted in impossible forms. Some soldiers thought at first it must be a mistake, that they were looking at bomb victims. Then the smell reached them. It wasn't a mistake. The train had carried prisoners evacuated from other camps, left to die when the guards fled. When the Americans reached the camp gates, they were met with a strange mix of defiance and confusion. A small contingent of SS guards still manned the towers. Others had abandoned their posts. The GIs cut through the fence and entered the main yard. What they saw defied anything they had imagined possible. Thousands of prisoners, skeletal, hollow-eyed, covered in sores, stumbled from the barracks. Some knelt and kissed the soldiers' boots. Others simply collapsed from exhaustion. Inside, there were piles of corpses stacked like cordwood, the crematorium still warm, the air heavy with ashes. Journalists and medics were called immediately. Photographers from the U.S. Army Signal Corps began documenting the camp, moving with clinical precision through horror. Lieutenant William P. Walsh of the 45th later wrote, "It wasn't a battlefield. It was an open grave the size of a town. As prisoners realized liberation had come, chaos turned to grief, then disbelief. Some survivors wept silently. Others shouted the names of loved ones who would never answer. Not every soldier kept his composure. Witnesses recalled that after seeing the boxcars and execution yard, some GIs opened fire on captured SS guards. Others had to be restrained. The rage was raw and unfiltered, a human reaction to inhuman sights. Officers restored order. But the day at Dachau would remain etched into every man's memory. By nightfall, Army doctors were triaging survivors. handing out rations carefully to prevent shock from overeating. Chaplains prayed among the dying. The war, for many of these men, suddenly took on new meaning. The fight against tyranny had become a fight for the very idea of humanity. The day after Dachau's liberation, the 45th and 42nd Divisions pressed onward toward Munich. The city that had once been the birthplace of the Nazi Party was now a ruin of collapsed roofs, twisted rails, and silent streets. Allied bombings had shattered its landmarks. The train yards burned, the government quarter gutted, and the grand avenues lined with rubble. What remained of organized German defense disintegrated before the advancing columns. By May 1st, American tanks rolled into the city center, where white flags hung from shattered windows. Civilians emerged from basements clutching small bundles, hands raised, eyes hollow from months of terror. In the same hours, word reached the front. Adolf Hitler was dead in Berlin. The announcement spread in fragments, whispered by radio operators, repeated by sergeants who could barely believe it. The reaction was muted. There was no cheering, only silence and relief. For many soldiers, it meant the fighting might finally stop. For others, it brought a sense of incompleteness. Too much had been lost to feel triumph. Munich's capture closed the southern campaign. The American 7th Army secured the region, seizing SS headquarters, intelligence files, and hidden caches of stolen art. Generals and war correspondents toured the city, remarking on the irony that the movement that once promised a 1,000-year Reich had ended in weeks of retreat and ashes. Nearby, the roads were clogged with German soldiers surrendering en masse. Thousands of POWs walked west, unarmed and exhausted, their uniforms stripped of insignia. At Dachau, Army engineers built temporary hospitals inside the barracks. Field kitchens served thin soup to the survivors, while medical officers worked around the clock to save those who could still be saved. Newsreels captured the scenes and carried them to the world. When those images reached the United States, the disbelief of the home front turned to stunned recognition. The war in Europe had not only been about liberation but revelation, the uncovering of what humanity was capable of for good and for evil. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the ruins of Munich, soldiers of the U.S. Army heard the words V-Day. Church bells rang once more, not in defiance, but in memory. When the guns finally fell silent, a strange quiet settled across Europe. For the American soldiers who had marched from Omaha to Dachau, the silence felt heavier than the noise that came before it. They wandered through captured cities where nothing moved but smoke and flags. Trucks loaded with displaced civilians rumbled west. Red Cross jeeps sped past columns of POWs. And once again the Army turned to its endless work, feeding, rebuilding, documenting. The men who had fought through Normandy, the Ardennes, and Bavaria were no longer just soldiers. They were witnesses. In the weeks after victory, George Stevens and his film crew from the U.S. Army's Special Film Project 186 arrived to document the aftermath. Their 16mm color footage from Dachau and Munich captured scenes too stark for words, body survivors, and the stunned faces of liberators. The images would later serve as evidence at Nuremberg, shaping how the world understood the crimes of the regime they had overthrown. For many GIs, those reels said what they could never bring themselves to describe. Repatriation began slowly. Some soldiers went home through Le Havre. Others waited months in camps along the Rhine. When they finally returned to America, parades greeted them. But the celebration often felt distant. Letters home mentioned Normandy and Paris, but rarely Dachau. There were no words for what they had seen there. The Army's psychological report spoke of battle fatigue, but behind the clinical language lay something deeper. The realization that survival carried its own weight. In time, the soldier's journey became history. Monuments rose on Omaha Beach, and Dachau became a memorial site visited by millions. The path between them, through hedgerows, forests, rivers, and ruins, became a map of liberation written in blood and endurance. Every mile carried a story of comrades lost, civilians freed, and a war that revealed both the worst and the best within humanity. As one veteran later wrote in a simple diary line, "We want to end tyranny. We found hell instead, but we kept walking." From the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Dachau, the journey of the American soldier was not just a passage through war. It was a proof that even in its darkest hours, the world could still be reclaimed.